Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Oregon HFMA webinar on hot topics impacting finance and revenue cycle from the CMS calendar year 2022 Outpatient Prospective Payment System Final Rule. It's definitely a mouthful. My name is Kit Lamb. I'm the chair of the chapter's Reimbursement Programs Committee for Oregon. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing and welcoming back our speaker, Valerie Winkle, this afternoon. Now, just a few announcements before we get started. So feel free to jot down questions via the Q&A function. Just in the interest of time, we'll save all the questions to the end and try to get through as many as we can. And then continuing education credits will be sent out after the session by email, as will be the slides for your reference. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to our survey for the webinar. If you wouldn't mind spending a couple of minutes afterwards providing your feedback, we'd sincerely appreciate it. And lastly, just want to take this opportunity to recognize and thank our wonderful chapter sponsors whose support allows us to really carry out our mission, including offering this type of education at no cost to the chapter. And many of our sponsors also donate their time and energy serving as volunteers and leaders of the chapter. So they go well beyond just providing the financial support. And so want to recognize those folks as well and thank those sponsor volunteers. And let's just go quickly through them. I have them up here just to recognize and call them out. So as our diamond sponsors, thank you, Professional Credit and Source DeLab and Centauri Health Solutions. Our platinum sponsors, CloudMed, KeyBank, Evolve Healthcare. Our gold sponsors, JetX, Medlytics, EnableComp, KPMG, Columbia Service, Access One, Extend Healthcare, Moss Adams, Merchant Credit, and blocking my screen, and yes, Panacea, Moss Adams as well. And then silver, we have Dingus, Cerecor and Associates, and the Wilshire Group. And last, but certainly not least, our bronze sponsors, Spectrum Health, Valley Credit Services, Washington Capital, Boost Healthcare Consulting, and Healthcare Resource Group. So with that, I'd like to again introduce Valerie. Valerie is a long-term HFMA and industry veteran and has presented to our chapter on a number of occasions. Again, so welcome back, Valerie. We really, truly appreciate your support of the chapter. Valerie is the president of Valorize Consulting and a regulatory specialist for HC Pro. She has more than 30 years of experience in healthcare policy. Healthcare policy, and her expertise spans CMS reimbursement methodologies and the operational capabilities necessary to effectively achieve accurate and defensible payment. She also possesses extensive hospital charge master, OPPS physician fee schedule, and provider-based departments experience. So really, in short, she's a Medicare industry guru, policy guru, and we're really grateful to have her here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Valerie. Please take us away.
All right. Thank you so much, Keith. So our topics today are talking about the change in the payment rates, a little bit about rural emergency hospitals, changes, the big changes in the rule, discussing the inpatient only procedure list and the applicability of the 2 midnight rule, a bit about site neutrality, 340B policies, price transparency, and telemedicine for hospitals. So like to start with where you can get the rule and the tables associated with the rule. So we have the URL link for you here. And remember, all the detail is embedded in the addenda or tables that are published with the rule. And so you see those listed there. Typically, you're primarily using that addendum B, which lists the services by CPT code, and then the APCs to which they're assigned, status indicators if they're not assigned to a payable APC, and then the payment rates. What's really important to understand about the outpatient prospective payment system is the status indicators assigned to each and every CPT or HCPC code, because that really impacts how the payment methodology works. Because not every code that needs to be reported is attached to a separate payment rate. There's a significant amount of what's called packaging, and there's some services that are billed by a hospital, which are paid under a different payment methodology and not under the outpatient prospective payment system. So you see the alphabet list of status indicators that are services defined to be paid under the outpatient prospective payment system, such as G, H, J1, J2, etc. And then the services that are payable under another payment system, which are indicated as A, C, F, L, and Y. A stands for a different fee schedule, and that primarily for outpatient services applies to the physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech language pathology, and ambulance services that are paid under fee schedule, as well as lab only outpatient claims that will then get paid under the clinical lab fee schedule when there's no other hospital services billed along with the labs. F and L are a few other cost-based vaccine payment systems. So those are not paid under OPPS either. Status indicators that are important to understand. The most important one I like to focus on is B. I like to think of B meaning there's a better HCPC code to report the service, because it'll tell you it's not recognized under OPPS and you won't get paid if you report the code that has the status indicator B. But the secondary definition is you should go and look to a different code. And the best example are all the E&M codes. So 99211, 212, 213, for example, they all carry a status indicator B. Well, what is the other code that a hospital reports? Well, a visit gets reported with the HCPC code G0463, for example. Then truly non-payable services by Medicare. So pro-fee only codes like the inpatient E&Ms would be an M, deleted CPT codes. E1 are items not covered by Medicare either, truly not benefits the program. And then E2 are typically drugs that they don't yet have pricing information. You would still report them as covered charges without the HCPC code until the pricing indicator is published. So packaging. You know, the inpatient prospective payment system is the ultimate packaging system where you get a single case payment rate for all the services furnished to the patient from admission to discharge. And then if you had outpatient services that meet that 3-day prior to admission rule, it would encompass those services as well. So one payment for the entire encounter. OPPS is intended to be a prospective payment bundled payment system, but when it started almost 21 years ago, it was much more of a fee schedule, and they've evolved it to more and more bundles or packages of services. The way they've done that is by assigning status indicator that means package to many of the codes that you still must report separately on the claim. So never separately paid is status indicator N. Still reported when appropriate following CPT reporting rules, but no separate payment. Payments embedded in the other items on the claim that are separately paid. Conditional packaging means that you may or may not receive separate payment depending on what else is reported on that same claim. And it's not by date of service anymore. So this is really an important point. If you are not required to bill a monthly claim, do not bill a monthly claim. More explicitly, do not bill radiation therapy and chemotherapy on monthly claims, because you will overpackage things that legitimately would receive separate payment if they were on date of service claims. So it's really important. The status indicators are Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. So Q1 is if any other service on that claim has a status indicator S, T, or V, it will not separately pay. Q2 is if any other procedure on that claim has a status indicator T, then Q2 service will not separately pay. Q3 codes are composite APCs. These typically apply to multiple imaging tests on a claim, MRI, CT ultrasound, that if there are two or more of those types of ultrasounds or MRIs, they're going to pay you a composite payment instead of individual test codes. And then Q4 apply to clinical lab services. If clinical lab tests are billed with other services, they package. Only clinical lab is on the claim, it will flip over and pay under the clinical lab fee schedule. All right, so let's talk about the financial impact that occurred. Overall, providers received a 2% update at the beginning of this calendar year, and that was comprised of a market basket of 2.7% with a minus 0.7% productivity adjustment, which is an adjustment that's provided for by statute, which then netted to the overall 2%. You can see the estimated impact based on the number of hospitals and whether you have wage index changes or not. It's very marginal. And then overall, for all providers, it was 1.6%, given some of the market basket changes. You can qualify for additional outlier payment on extraordinarily high cost, like a surgical case or something like that, that was extraordinarily high cost. It's very difficult to, however, because the cost threshold that you must exceed is $6,100, and that's difficult on an outpatient claim to exceed that amount. So not often do you have outliers on outpatient. There are certain hospitals that have protections under the OPPS payment system. So critical access hospitals, they're not even recognized or paid under OPPS. They're paid their cost-based reimbursement. And then children's hospitals and cancer hospitals have a permanent hold harmless protection. Children's hospitals get a TOPS payment and cancer hospitals get a payment to cost adjustment, meaning that they do an estimate of what the OPPS payments in total were compared to cost of the hospitals, and that's about 0.89, as you see there. And then all the cancer hospital outpatient services are brought up to where their cost for Medicare is brought to a payment level of 0.89, similar to other PPS hospitals. And then rural sole community hospitals and essential access community hospitals, they get a boost to OPPS payment of 7.1%. Now, the Consolidated Appropriations Act created a new classification of hospitals called rural emergency hospitals. And this new provider type will start for calendar year 2023, so next year. So in the proposed rule, CMS had solicited input as to what criteria they should apply other than the statutory criteria. And the statutory criteria states that a rural emergency hospital, obviously it's going to be rural, it must provide emergency and observation services, but it would not have to have inpatient certified beds. So CMS didn't finalize any particular topics that they received comments on. They're going to do that obviously in this year's rulemaking cycle. Annually, CMS has to recalibrate the system. So just like they do with the inpatient prospective payment system, where they recalibrate based on claims and cost reports, the DRG weights, they do the same thing for the APC weights. And they typically are using claims data from 2 years past, and then the most current cost reports available in the HCRA system. Well, because of the coronavirus and the impact to case mix on all hospitals when they had to accommodate the surges of COVID cases and cancel elective procedures and typical services that they would otherwise normally provide, the whole foundation of the prospective payment systems were eroded. You didn't have the typical average mix of services at those hospitals anymore. If they had used 2020 claim data and 2020 cost reports, it would have caused a significant shift in payment rates based on the unusual mix of services. So both in the inpatient rule and the outpatient rule, the decision was to continue payment rates based on 2019 data and not to update using 2020 data. So the big question on everybody's minds now with the inpatient rule that's due the beginning of next month due in April for 2023 is now that we all know that 2021 was a very unusual year as well, particularly in certain areas of the country. What data is CMS going to base 2023 payment rates are for inpatient and for outpatient? Are they going to do a blend of 2020 and 2021? Are they going to do a blend of 2019 and 2021? What are they going to do? And that is really the huge policy issue that we're all going to be watching. There's never been a time where CMS blended data like this, but yet would that be a transition period? Does it, there's just a lot of questions on this. So I encourage everybody to be watching, and it's very likely what they do for IPPS is what they will also do then for OPPS. Because they decided to use 2019 data for continuing payment rates in 2022, they extended some of the pass-through and add-on payments because they didn't bake those costs into the new payment rates, because that they would have needed 2020 data to do that. So that led to the extension of quite a few products for the inpatient new technology add-on, as well as for outpatient pass-through products. So this table, let me orient you for a moment. We basically do this pivot table when I see some colleagues and I came up with this concept where on the first column, those are status indicators representative of 2021 status indicators and assignments. And then the brand new columns across the top have status indicators for 2022. And then that's why that first row after the status indicators are for what brand new codes are. So you can see over in the total column, 325 new codes. You can see how they array in terms of assignment by status indicator. So 20 of them were comprehensive APC with J1 status indicator, and 9 of them were assigned inpatient only codes. The big change that we'll get into in a few moments about reversing their policy to phase out the inpatient only list meant that 257 procedures that had J1 for 2021 reverted to the inpatient only status indicator of C. So that's why that's highlighted in yellow. You can see down on N that 10 codes that were N in 2021 are changing to E2 in 2022, meaning there was no cost assignment. Doesn't mean it's non-covered, just means no cost assignment. You report them as packaged until you get a new HCPC code with payment rate, and oftentimes that's applied retroactive in the transmittal. So it's something you have to watch for. But total of 815 changes, which is really less than we've seen in prior years. So other than the ones we've just highlighted, not a lot of big changes in payment rates or status indicators. So there are quite a few policies for which CMS has held steady for numerous years and has not had changes. So for example, outpatient hospital visits being billed with GO463, but emergency department visits being billed with the AMA CPT codes, or the for type B ED, the HCPC codes for type B ED, for example. Continuing to pay for pass-through drugs at ASP +6 unless they qualify for a 340B discount. And the packaging drug threshold continues to get its annual inflation update rounded to 5, which it remained at $130 for this year. No changes in drug administration payment policies, no new comprehensive APCs for surgeries or for observation, they remain the same. Partial hospitalization services are the same. Therapeutic radiopharmaceuticals, brachytherapy sources, and blood and products were all the same. So no real changes to any of these. So the real big policy I mentioned a few moments ago is that CMS had finalized a phase out of the procedures that weren't covered or payable under the outpatient prospective payment system, called the inpatient only procedure list. And they had proposed to phase it out over 3 years, and they took a lot of musculoskeletal procedures and assigned them APC assignments in 2021. So for 2022, the administration reversed that policy. They said they received a lot of input from stakeholders that they said that was a bad policy. And I think the reason it's a bad policy from a patient safety standpoint is that CMS has tied this policy so tightly to the freestanding ambulatory surgery center. But really, if you separate it from ASC policies and just think about hospitals, patients in a hospital that's licensed in a hospital, operating as a hospital, you have to meet all the conditions of participation in patient safety requirements, regardless of whether that patient is ordered to be an inpatient or outpatient. You're going to assign them to the surgical suite with all the proper equipment and stuff to receive these services in a safe way. The real underlying concern here was payment, because Medicare didn't have data to make legitimate outpatient payment assignments for this. The other comment that I do think is very legitimate is that this has significant unintended impact for Medicare Advantage and commercial payers who love it when Medicare takes something off the inpatient only procedure, because then they are going to try to force outpatient payment on you, irrespective of the acute status of the patient, unfortunately. So what did they finalize? They completely halted that phase out. Basically, the inpatient only list will remain. And then 295 of the procedures that they had removed from the list and assigned APCs, they reverted back, and those go on the inpatient only list. They allowed 3 procedures to remain off the list based on stakeholder comment. My real concern is that they recodified 5 criteria that the evaluator used to determine something needing to be on the inpatient only list. And I have no problem with the first 3 or 4 criteria, but that's that 5th one that I think is problematic. So I think it's legitimate for them to say, well, if most hospital outpatient departments aren't ready to provide this service on an outpatient basis, then we leave it inpatient only. That's really a kind of a moot point, as I mentioned a moment ago, but that's okay. Simplest procedure described by the code can be furnished in most outpatient departments. So they want to make sure it's pretty ubiquitous and it's not limited to just like a certain type of academic center or something like that to be able to do on an outpatient basis. The procedure code could be related to codes that they've already determined can be safely done as an outpatient. That's fine. The determination that the procedure is already furnished in numerous hospitals on outpatient basis. That one's hard to meet, because if you don't want to perform services and not get paid, not get covered and paid, right? So hospitals really watch closely to make sure they're not inadvertently performing an inpatient only procedure on an outpatient, right? Because that precludes you from being paid. So that one's kind of hard to meet. It's this last one though that really bothers me. They make a determination that the procedure can be appropriately and safely furnished in an ASC, and it is on the list of the ASC services. Why? Because hospitals have always been able to perform more services on an outpatient basis than what are allowed or able to be performed in freestanding ASCs. And hospitals are licensed as hospitals. ASCs are very different. So I feel like that's inappropriately mixing things with that 5th criteria. The other thing, if you recall, is when they eliminated the inpatient only list, they said, as we're phasing certain procedures out for the inpatient only list, we don't want hospitals to be penalized if they decide to make a patient inpatient who then doesn't meet the inpatient only list. So we're going to preclude them from denial by the QIO and the recovery auditors for a period of 2 years. And so they basically reverted back and said that they're going to, for any procedure removed from the inpatient only list, they exempt from the QIO, RAC, and other contractor medical reviews related to the 2 midnight policy will revert to this 2-year time frame. So that they did that back with the reinstatement of the inpatient only list. Okay, what are the status of the site neutrality policies? So this particular policy is where CMS had, as I think of it, cherry picked that G0463 and said that even if you were performing that visit in a grandfathered outpatient hospital department that you're billing with modifier PO because it's off campus, we are going to use our authority and reduce that payment by 60%. And we'll phase it in over 2 years. Well, AHA and hospitals filed suit on CMS, and initially AHA and hospitals won. And when they initially won, the court ordered that CMS repay that 30% reduction for the 2019 claims. CMS repaid, but then CMS appealed, and the appeals court overturned it and upheld CMS's policy. And then AHA tried to appeal to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court did not agree to take the case, which means that the district court appeals decision is final, and CMS then prevailed. So CMS has now retaken back that 30% payment on 2019 claims. They had always continued the reduction on 2020 claims. And of course, 21, we're into 22. So that means when you're billing that G0463 with modifier PO, because the location is an older off-campus provider-based department. When I say older, it wasn't part of section 603, meaning it started well before 11 to 2015, then you always are supposed to get total OPPS payment, but that one service is going to receive that 60% reduction. CMS has not proposed any other payment reductions. We don't know what we're going to see. My guess is not anything new in this area for this next rulemaking either, but I think in the future we might see things once this COVID period ends. Okay, drugs and biologics. Remember, if you get payment for drugs that are below a daily cost of $130 within the APCs that are paid, then if it's a pass-through drug, it's eligible for ASP plus 6%, and that's for a period of 2 to 3 years when it's new. Then it goes to a separately payable drug outside its pass-through status if it's above that packaging threshold, and that's when it's eligible for the 340B drug program reduction, which remains at ASP minus 22.5%. That reduction is not applicable to rural sole community hospitals, children's hospitals, or PPS exempt cancer hospitals. And then brand new drugs and biologicals that haven't any ASP data are paid at wholesale acquisition cost plus 3%. This particular policy was combined by the AHA and hospitals, also a suit on CMS, and it basically ruled that the 340B payment reduction was legal. Then AHA appealed, and the Supreme Court has now agreed to review the circuit court's decision. We had the arguments last fall, and we'll probably get a decision on this by June, right, of this year. So waiting still on the decision. CMS continues to say they feel that the discount could even be deeper than ASP minus 22.5%, but they have remained at that level. And I know they tried to do a hospital survey, and it was very difficult for them to get good data. Pass-through devices. Remember, more pass-through devices remain on pass-through list because they were using 2019 data. So you see the list of device HCPCS codes here, and those that have a Y are the new ones that are eligible for pass-through. Remember, this is really dependent on your bill charge. The best, most defensible pricing for pass-through drugs and biologics is your invoice cost divided by your operating cost to charge ratio. If you have a price any less than that, you are leaving legitimate dollars on the table. All right, price transparency. So just a reminder that additional policies went into effect in these policies, initial policies went into effect January 1, 2021. And then for this year, they strengthened certain things. So they proposed and finalized increasing the civil monetary penalties. That change is based on bed count, so it significantly increased the penalty for larger hospitals. They finalized requirements that if you are relying on a price estimator tool as opposed to posting the shoppable services list, that the expectation is that tool provide a real-time, customized, single estimate of the patient's out-of-pocket expense, taking into account their insurance benefits, which is not something that the postable shoppable service list needs to do. They finalized additional criteria for the single all items and services machine readable file, and talked about improving descriptions on the shoppable services list. So basically, there has been no movement on the suit brought by AHA about price transparency, and it's sort of where, you know, the horse has left the barn. And so we are in a situation where CMS is sending letters to hospitals after having evaluating the websites as to whether they meet the price transparency requirements. These letters are very strange. They don't always make a lot of sense in terms of what they're focusing on in terms of compliance, whether they ask for a corrective action plan or just make a correction. But several facilities have received the letters and are moving towards making corrections. Note that machine readable file of the 5 different types of standardized charges has to be available for direct download and automated searches, because they're really trying to tee this up for vendors to be able to troll hospital websites, suck the data in, and then produce comparisons that are supposed to help drive the consumer ability of healthcare to make election. Of course, we all know the flaws in some of that thinking, but what you don't want to do is immediately adjust prices, your gross prices, based on what you can easily now see your neighbors for similar services, because that is not going to help you, the hospital. It will only temporarily aid the government programs that use charges to set their payment rates. So it's really important that you don't just quickly adjust your charges. Telehealth, this is really timely right now because Congress just introduced an omnibus bill trying to extend some of the Medicare flexibilities for telehealth for an additional 151 days. Then a different bill has been introduced to allow for 2 more years the acute hospital care at home. But neither one of these bills provide for flexibility that hospitals need for outpatients that are at the home receiving telehealth services from the hospital. So there's a gap and remains to be seen. So physicians in their practices receive payment parity for the limited telehealth benefit, even when physicians are not at their office, when they're rendering a telehealth service to a patient in their home. Hospitals receive site neutral payments if they follow the CMS instructions to temporarily relocate their outpatient departments. And they can either bill GO 463 with modifier PO or PN when the telehealth visit is either conducted by staff as ordered by the clinician, and or the clinician as at the hospital when the telehealth visit is generated. If the physician or clinician is not in the hospital, even if it's a registered outpatient, the hospital is limited to just billing that telehealth site originating fee, that Q 2014 code. People use this term telehealth so broadly, and Medicare has a very limited scope definition of it. So there's a lot of confusion, but note that there are a lot of services that are remote services relying on technology, which they have unique CPT codes. They are not telehealth in Medicare's world. So Medicare will continue to cover and pay for those as remote services. But the challenge is that Medicare hasn't treated all these types of services consistently. So some have OPPS payable status indicators as a visit or as a significant procedure, but then others have that status indicator B, go find a better code, which typically points you back to using that GO 463. And even of more concern is that some have a status indicator M, which is really incorrect. Unfortunately, with Congress and in some of CMS's policies, they just don't have a good conception of how hospitals incur cost when they render remote services or even telehealth services. And I think that we're going to remain in this boat if their hospitals don't give a lot of good examples and data about how they use technology to support their hospital outpatients during the pandemic, and then need to remain that after the public health emergency is stopped, right? Because you've now done a conversion for much of the work that you do to support outpatients, and your clinicians have converted, and it will be problematic to try to pull all those patients back in-house. It's not good when you can have much better infection control and stuff. So but it will be problematic if you can't get paid. You can't bill and get paid for any of that cost. So it's going to be important to advocate to CMS on that. So I like to talk about this particular topic. CMS states that OPPS is a prospective payment system, not a cost-based system, and it's based on averages, which payment for certain cases may exceed the cost incurred, while for others it may not. So that averaging concept, right? Why this is important is that hospitals have to accurately report HCPCS codes and charges, and they need to accurately set those gross charges using their cost, and understanding that CMS takes those gross charges and applies or multiplies that cost charge ratio to calculate cost. And the reason this is important too is not just for Medicare. It's important because a lot of commercial payers have been denying charges on itemized bills that you have to bill separately, particularly for inpatients that go into some outlier status. They're sending those itemized bills to a vendor who's just using optical character reading and saying, oh, I don't like this description. It's a point of care lab, or it's this or that. And they're denying all that, bringing the cost of the case down into the case rate and no longer qualifying it for outlier payment. And yet they're violating their own contract, as well as a lot of Medicare and other federal rules that they're required to follow when they do that. So it's really important to come back to citations like this about how you have to consistently report all the services. And by report, that means post it on the patient's accounts, whether Medicare or non-Medicare, inpatient or out, and bill it consistently. So what are some of the challenges? A number of those CPT codes that I mentioned have assigned B, meaning go find a better code. Many providers don't understand that. And so they don't bother to report it, or they say it's non-covered. And I'll give you a great example. You may have genetic counselors. I'm not talking about MDs or non-physician practitioners. I'm talking about other licensed staff as genetic counselors that you've employed. And if they're rendering a covered, like the patient has cancer and they need to understand based on the genetic test some of their treatment options related to that result of that test, and a genetic counselor is ordered by the doctor to explain that to the patient, that is a therapeutic service that's covered by Medicare, and that would be billable and payable as an outpatient visit, but only if you report that with GO 463. If you go look at the CPT codes for genetic counseling, they have a status indicator B, and you would not get paid if you report those CPT codes. So many people see B and say, oh, it's not covered by Medicare. We either have to do it for free, or we have to have this worst, have the patient sign an ABN or a waiver. That's really not appropriate. The next thing that's important is that a lot of people don't understand the order of operations for health insurance, right? It starts with what payer is the patient eligible under? You know, is this a motor vehicle accident, or is this truly a Medicare patient? Then you have to, once you know the eligibility, then you look to that payer's coverage policies, and you're only supposed to bill for payment from that insurance company for what's covered. Otherwise, you will get denied. And this is what a lot of the recovery auditors are denying for outpatient services, because when you send in your record, you're just sending in your record for the surgery, let's say. And the coverage rules say, oh, patient had to go through 6 months of conservative treatment and PTOT, and all of that has to have failed before we're willing to pay for this invasive surgery. If you don't have a process to go get all that records and put it into the chart along with the chart just for the surgery, and then when you're audited, submit all of that information, you're going to suffer a denial. Okay, so that's our updates, and I am definitely open to take questions. And I think our questions coming in the chat.
Hey, Valerie, actually, I think you've done such a great job. I haven't seen any questions come through yet, but I actually have some of my own if you don't mind.
No problem.
Well, first, I guess I'll ask you to look into your crystal ball and share your thoughts on any new policies that you anticipate CMS will be focused on in this upcoming rulemaking cycle. You mentioned earlier IPPS and yes.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing will be what data they use for the payment rates, as I mentioned earlier. So are they going to use a blend of 2020, 2021, 2019, and 2020? I mean, what are they going to do? That's a big thing. I do think this, because of so much angst about telehealth versus remote services and stuff, I can see CMS hopefully doing a bit more in this rule to explain where hospitals can render remote services and they be covered and payable as outpatient hospital services. So I hope that that is an additional policy area that they will focus on. I do not think, but I could be wrong, I guess maybe this is partly a hope, that they don't expand that 60% payment reduction piece to any other services beyond that GO 463 with a modifier PO, right? That they don't pick any other services. But now that courts upheld it, I'm worried that they could just start to pick one by one a service and say, we're putting you under notice and we're going to start taking a 60% reduction when it's performed off campus. I don't think this administration is headed in that direction, but that would be a concern. And then the prior auth program, last year they didn't increase any of the services for the outpatient hospital prior auth program, but that may indeed see some additional services being introduced for that, because some audits are just starting to get released. And even after getting prior auth, it's looking like that problem about submitting just the chart for the surgery is still happening. So when an auditor says, okay, well, you did this blepharoplasty, eyelid procedure, so I know you got prior auth, but I want to check your chart. Well, the hospital just submits the chart for the blepharoplasty and it doesn't have any of the information about the eyelid test and the vision test and all that stuff that was back up in the doctor's office, and they're getting denied.
Oh.
So this is a real problem that hospitals think, oh, we're only responsible for our little part that happened on the day here. That doesn't prove coverage. You've got to go back and get all that from the doctor first, and then include it when you release your chart. So I definitely do think that's a potential.
Got it. Yeah, that seems like it could blow up very quickly just based on the sheer amount of procedures being done. We have another question just come through here. Do you have any other strategies to fight payer unbundling line item denials on inpatient hospital plans?
I do have strategies, and I've actually been an expert witness in cases, and it's a combination of using their own contract language that mandates you're not contracted with any commercial payer that doesn't mandate that you keep your participation in Medicare in good standing. So then you have to say, by virtue of that clause, all of the Medicare cost reporting rules are required by the commercial payer as well, which speaks to how you have to charge and bill. And then there's also all the code sets from HIPAA, which are the other set of laws. So when you pull all this together, it makes a very structured legal argument. But the only way to get commercial payers, you have to keep your appeal rights in play for each case they're doing this, but you need to elevate this to legal counsel and have legal counsel use this reasoning to discuss it with your payers, and more hospitals are doing that.
Yeah. So in other words, refer to the parity, right, that you're required legally from CMS in charging the services you charged everybody, right, which is consistent. And then to involve legal to actually put some weight behind the appeal process. Which when you start involving legal, it's probably great to have, for that particular payer, to quantify all that they've done in terms of denials and not just one-off claims, right? The issue in whole and not just individual claims.
It's the issue in whole, and the HIPAA laws too are a part of that, and it's when you lay it all out. I mean, basically, I've worked with enough different attorneys that it's very clear. But the payer will turn around and try to use those same Medicare citations, like they're applying it in the way they feel that they apply. And so there's a concept about standing. The commercial payers don't have the authority by law to use the Medicare citations in the limited way that they're choosing to do so, right? It's only Medicare that has that ability. So there's definitely some legal parts to it.
Yeah, and not to mention, at least from my experience, Medicare is not line item denying, right?
That's true, but that's where the HIPAA transaction sets come in, because if point of care lab test is a perfect one. It's got a CPT code, you've got transmittals, you're required by NUBC and by CPT to report each diagnostic lab test that's ordered and resulted. So you put all that together, you can't just say, oh, you're not supposed to separately bill a point of care test because a nurse did it. That's improper.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that.
Sure.
Another question, can hospitals charge different rates for the same service between commercial payer and Medicare? For example, a Medicare hospice patient receiving the same service as a commercial hospital patient have different charges on the account.
So for hospital services, you are required to post the same gross price on all patient accounts that receive that exact same service. Mm-hmm. Now, how you bill that claim can differ, because you can take a contractual discount adjustment, right? You can net down either pre-billing or after your payment when you take your contractual or discount deductions that you've negotiated, but you must post the same gross charge, because that's what's going into your income statement and going into the cost report. And it's a major requirement of cost reporting, and you'll violate your participation status with Medicare if you have different gross prices posted on patients' accounts.
I hope that answers the question. If not, please send a follow-up question on that. When you think about all of the changes that recently took place, as well as what you're anticipating coming down the pipe soon, is there anything else that jumps out at you as particularly impactful for our organ providers?
One of the concerns is that CMS hinted that they may take that exception for the 340B drug program away from sole community hospitals and essential access community hospitals in the future. So I know that so many rural and Oregon hospitals carry those statuses, and that they rely upon that program very much to reduce their expenses. So if your payment went down that much, that could be a big threat. And then on the positive side, I think this new rural emergency hospital type of hospital is a positive, right? So there may be certain hospitals in rural areas that are struggling perhaps to meet all the criteria to have inpatient beds or swing beds. And so now that there may be this other alternative to be an emergency hospital with observation beds, that they can serve their community, but then have the ability to transfer out if the need is there, that might be a great option in certain communities that would help because of the rural nature of much of our state.
That's right. Thank you for that. Well, I don't see any other questions coming through now. So that was wonderful as usual, Valerie. Thank you so much on
I
behalf of our
think
chapter.
I might see one about
Oh, do you?
the criteria for inpatient only.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I see now. I see. Yes.
Okay.
Q&A box. Yep.
Okay. So the criteria are Medicare's criteria. So Medicare uses those 5 criteria, and let me go back to that on my slide. I can try to get back to it. These 5 criteria on this slide, Medicare uses those 5 criteria to decide whether a particular CPT procedure code belongs on the inpatient only list or not. So they then publish in the addenda with the rule, the procedures that all carry status indicator C, which is the status indicator that indicates the coverage and payment of that procedure is only when the patient is an inpatient. Now, remember that a few years ago, ideally the patient's ordered to be an inpatient and registered to be an inpatient prior to the procedure. But if they are an outpatient when they get the procedure and then you realize it before discharge that they should have been admitted, you can have an admission to be an inpatient on after the procedure or the day after the procedure if they're still in your hospital, and still bill it all as an inpatient and get inpatient payment. So it does not, they made that change several years ago. So you want to really watch for these services to be sure that you can make them an inpatient. And even if it turns out that like there was something that happened intraoperatively and you're not sure how it's going to code out because, you know, coders look at it later, but you know it was more extensive than the outpatient service that was planned, it's better to get the inpatient admission order to protect your hospital than if it turns out to not code out as an inpatient only procedure. You can follow your self-denial for an inpatient and you'll still get the same OPPS payment that you would have gotten even if you had not made the admission order. But if it does code out to be inpatient only, you've protected yourself. So just a word of caution, there's some certain operational things you can do to best protect yourself with this inpatient only policy.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for catching that.
Sure.
I put the text in there to use the Q&A function. Folks were using both the chat and Q&A functions.
Yeah.
I missed that, but wonderful. So again, Valerie, on behalf of our chapter, thanks so much for sharing your expertise. Always love hearing the updates from you. I know you're going to Baltimore to rub elbows with policymakers soon. So please, please advocate for the state, our provider community. I did get some questions about whether the slides will be made available, and yes, they will. They'll be emailed out to all registrants after this webinar. And so please take a moment. You'll see it also in the chat box up above, and provide your feedback through our survey so that we can continue to enhance the education we provide to the chapter. And with that, I'd like to say good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining Oregon HFMA's webinar. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.